Hi, welcome to session 12 of History 3380, World Civilizations. In the last session, we were looking at the development of the American mission, the spread of American ideas in terms of modern capitalism, ideas like consumerism, individualism, competitiveness. And we also saw, near the end of that session, some of the challenges to the spread of that mission, especially when the United States used military force in places like Vietnam to try to spread this mission of modernization, or its version of it. Despite those challenges, we also saw that one aspect of American culture that was certainly continuing to have influence even in the 50s and 60s and 70s as the United States faced various challenges to its mission was consumerism. And we're going to look today and throughout this session at what appeared to be the ultimate triumph of that mission of modernization, or globalization as we've come to call it, in the last quarter of the 20th and beginning of the 21st centuries. We're going to see how suddenly it appeared that most of the world wanted to embrace much of what was the American mission. But we'll also see in the second half of the session how that process of globalization has itself caused a series of reactions, some of which are positive in terms of embracing aspects of American culture and American institutions, but other aspects are rejected by various cultures for a variety of reasons, and we'll be looking at that as well. If we turn to the first slide, I've offered a list here of some of the challenges to Americanization by the middle of the 20th century. One obvious one was communism, communist revolution in Soviet Russia, Chinese Revolution in 1950, spread of communism through Eastern Europe and parts of Southeast Asia. And communism essentially was the exact opposite of American capitalism, calling for state control of the economy, redistribution of wealth through society. Nationalism, which we saw erupting throughout much of the world as societies threw off the old European colonial structures, represented another challenge because it often took the form of economic nationalism, of a desire to keep out foreign trade, or especially foreign investment, in order for countries to develop their own industrial resources. That became linked to ideas about statist economics, meaning instead of simply letting the free market prevail, as Americans would promote, that the state should take a major role, essentially creating various forms of socialistic economies where the state creates mechanisms to redistribute wealth, to ensure that gross inequalities don't develop, and where the government at least guides much of the economic system itself. Beyond that, there were considerable conflicts in other areas, including over cultural issues. American versions of modernization put a great deal of emphasis on the individual. But in other cultures, as we've seen, dating all the way back to before even the early modern period of history, societies had focused on ideas of extended kin groups, of patron-client relationships, many of which had communal aspects to them. This does not mean that people didn't think as individuals, but rather that issues of family, community often weighed more heavily in their judgments and their decisions than did their concerns about their own individual well-being. So this often clashed with American ideas. And another instance would be generally what Americans would describe as traditionalism, of the idea that people often engage in various ritualistic practices or even certain types of economic activity simply because of traditional experiences. Whereas Americans were always promoting the idea of change, of ever constant change, the drive to improve productivity, the drive to attain what Americans had defined as progress, economic development, greater development of the state and social institutions, etc. Other cultural conflicts, and we've seen some of this coming, existed between Islamic societies and the West, especially the United States, over issues such as secularism. What role does religion, or should religion, play in the larger society? And Islam puts a great deal of stress on the influence of religious concepts and religious law throughout society, and also over very basic issues of male-female relationships and the role of women in society, etc. Americans had a very strong emphasis in their own society, despite their own religious leanings, towards secularism, the idea that religion would not be the primary influence in state systems, legal systems, etc. And of course, especially by the second half of the 20th century, the United States had a rather freewheeling popular culture, often given vent in magazines, television, and later computers. Despite these obstacles, it appeared, beginning in the 1980s, that these obstacles were crumbling. The walls were tumbling down in terms of resistance in the United States, and this seemed to happen specifically in the field of economics. In 1982, a major debt crisis struck in Latin America. Leading U.S. banks, including Citibank, it's now Citicorp, Bank of America, and others, J.P. Morgan, had loaned over $300 billion to leading countries like Mexico, Brazil, Argentina. Huge sums of money. And now these countries were unable to pay those debts, Mexico being the first to essentially warn that it was going to be unable to service its debt. The monies had been borrowed to spur economic development. Foreign banks, especially American banks, have been quite willing to loan this money at a time when huge amounts of money, billions of dollars, were pouring in from Middle Eastern and other countries that were oil producers. Oil prices were high in the 1970s. These banks were looking for profitable returns on the large amount of capital that they held. And of course, saw lending money to governments in Latin America as a very secure and profitable venture. But by the beginning of the 1980s, recession had struck in the developed world, interest rates were rising rapidly, and these two conditions, the first of which meant declining exports for Latin American countries, and the second of which meant that monthly payments, the service on the debt, was going up dramatically, put a squeeze on these countries, and they literally were unable to pay their debts. Now, this crisis, for a time, appeared to threaten the entire financial structure of the world. Well, American banks were the leading lenders in this region. Others, including banks in Western Europe and Japan, had also lent considerable amounts of money. And if the Latin American countries as a group stopped paying their debts completely, this would put at risk the viability of leading U.S. banks in particular, Citibank especially, and Bank of America. And if those should fail, of course, what was envisioned was a series of toppling dominoes as financial institutions across the globe, one after another, collapsed in the face of this financial crisis. That seemed to be a very real threat. To cope with the threat, a bankers committee was formed, leading international bankers coming together to devise strategies for solving the problem. But critical to the solution of this process now, in the post-war world, was the International Monetary Fund, which would help coordinate strategy and provide essentially the policies that would be pursued in trying to solve this problem. Initially, the answer was short-term extensions of credit from the banks and from the IMF to tide these countries over, essentially loaning them enough additional money so they could make payments on all the money they'd already borrowed. And it was thought at the time that this would be a sufficient solution, that conditions would turn around, economic growth would resume in the developed countries, interest rates would start to come down, and eventually the debt crisis would more or less solve itself. However, the crisis persisted, and a new perspective developed, what became known as the Washington Consensus. A perspective developed by American economists, bankers, but also developed in conjunction with other international authorities. And the Washington Consensus essentially said, this isn't a passing problem. This is a structural problem. Short-term loans won't solve it. And the structural problem is this, that these countries, as we have seen, since the Great Depression, have walled themselves off from much of the international market. They have created protectionist barriers to prevent imports, tried to develop their own domestic industries. As a result, their exports aren't growing rapidly, certainly not rapidly enough to pay off their debts. And this system of state-promoted industrialization is inefficient. So what must happen is that they must reverse these strategies that they've pursued for nearly half a century in order to solve the debt crisis, in order to set exports growing so that they can earn the money to pay off their debts. Central in this thinking was the work of people like Milton Friedman, a bleeding proponent of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, essentially, as I've mentioned before, was a philosophy, an economic philosophy, that said that what the world economy needed was a return to the liberal policies of the 19th century. Cut back on government spending, government regulation. Let the free market operate. The strategies being proposed for Latin America follow precisely those dictates. Roll back protectionist tariffs, diminish the role of the state in the economy. And more than that, the neoliberals felt that not just economic policy, but most policies that governments pursued should be determined by the marketplace. For example, Social Security should not consist of a state system of taxation that withdraws money from people's paychecks and from corporations and then puts it aside for the future. Instead, there should be a free enterprise retirement system where people essentially save their own money and decide where to put it. So privatization of Social Security was a typical example of what the neoliberals felt was the most expeditious way to deal with issues in society and in the political system as well as the economic system. Let market systems decide the issues for us rather than trying to dictate policy from above. We've seen in the previous session that these ideas weren't just emanating from Washington or from the developed world. That the United States, for decades, had been seeking to train economists and other technocrats around the globe in these ideas. The Chicago boys, the Chilean economists, trained by the economists at the University of Chicago, especially Milton Friedman, were just one example of thousands and thousands of such technocrats trained around the globe. So when the crisis hits and when this Washington Consensus develops, it isn't just a matter of the developed world imposing this on developing countries. There are many people in developing countries, many technocrats, who already ascribe to this sort of economic philosophy and are eager to try it out as a solution to the debt crisis. And indeed, the influence of these events, as we will see, went far beyond Latin America. Although the debt crisis was largely confined there, in fact, the crisis and the turning towards this strategy of opening up economies, reducing the role of the state, these ideas flourished around the globe in the years after 1982. And much of the world, most of its economies were affected to some degree by this strategy and this philosophy. The basic mechanics of how this was instituted in Latin America were, first of all, debt for equity swaps. And although this sounds like something very technical in terms of the jargon, it was really quite simple. These countries owed billions of dollars in foreign debt. And the question was, how were they to pay it off and pay it off with reasonable speed? Well, generating more export revenues would help, but that was going to take some time. And even as those export revenues grew, it would be years and years of increased revenues that would be necessary to fully pay off the debt. But another quick way of reducing debt would be to swap the debt for equity. And this is what that meant. These countries had equity. They had capital goods that they owned. In many Latin American countries, the government owned the electrical power system, the telephone system. It might own steel plants and other forms of industrial enterprise, shipyards, etc. What debt for equity meant was that a government could reduce its debt by handing over some of these state-owned enterprises to foreign investors who would then wipe out a portion of the debt for them. Okay, we have a national power grid, power generating plants and power transmission lines, and it's worth, let's just say, $20 billion. So when foreign investors are allowed to come in and take it over, they're the ones who wipe out $20 billion of our debt for us. They pay off our debt in return for getting hold of our assets. And what this did, of course, is it killed two birds with one stone from the viewpoint of neoliberal economists. It meant, on the one hand, the debt was reduced, and two, the role of the state in the economy was reduced because the state is selling off assets and turning them over to private investors, many foreign, but also some domestic. So free enterprise would now have a larger role to play in their economies. This was part of a second strategy, which was simply to downsize the state, not just by having the state sell off assets, but by having the state cut expenditures, especially on social services, things like education, public health, privatizing Social Security. The state would be literally pared down to a smaller size. And in doing so, more state revenues would be available to pay off the debt. So again, we get a dual effect. One, the state gets smaller, which is what neoliberals feel is the best course of action for development. And on the other hand, more of the debt gets paid off because more government revenue is now available. It's not going to schools or hospitals, it's going to pay off the debt. And then the third strategy was to end protectionism, to end high tariffs, to end quotas, the kinds of things that were obstacles to greater participation in the international economy, and especially obstacles to creating larger exports, the revenues from which could be used again to pay off debt. So in each of these strategies, there's a twofold purpose: pay off the debt and also pursue neoliberal policies about reducing the size of the state and allowing free markets to operate. This was the strategy that flourished in Latin America, but was also adopted in many other parts of the world by countries at this time. One place where such strategies were particularly noticeable was in India. After independence from Great Britain, India had pursued policies of economic socialism and state economic control. It's not that India didn't have private enterprise, it certainly did, lots of it. But the state had a very large role in the economy. Not only in state-owned assets, but in state control of the larger economy. For example, the government would control what goods were imported, how much, and these goods included essential items for private industry. Quotas could be set, tariffs could be set at particular levels to decide how much of foreign imports were going to be allowed, let us say, for the chemical industry, for a tractor factory that needs these goods from the outside. The government could dictate all of that. In the policies of liberalization adopted as of 1991, we get an end to protectionism. In other words, a dramatic reduction in these tariffs and other obstacles to international trade, and a reduction in the number of state-owned industries. So even though India hadn't suffered the kind of debt crisis that Latin America did, nevertheless, it too was pursuing policies very similar to the ones that Latin American states were adopting. The effect was very immediate in India, with its exports increasing sevenfold in just over a decade. And by then, India was also entering on a technological revolution, with a highly educated group of technocrats, people trained in various, but especially computer technologies. India became a centerpiece for the development of the world computer technology and internet industries. India became a success story with these policies. But one of the problems was that despite tremendous leaps in economic growth that have continued right into the 21st century, the gap between rich and poor remained drastic. The top 20% of income earners, as indicated here, earned 46% of the national income. The bottom 10%, just over 8% of national income. A problem that we saw back with the American mission earlier in the century still persists in this age of globalization. And that is that, yes, we can help ramp up economic growth with new policies. But those policies do nothing to address the inequalities in income distribution within societies. So we get tremendous economic growth nationally, but still the acute disparities between rich and poor remain. And this becomes a persistent problem as globalization affects so much of the world in the last decades of the 20th century. Even the Soviet Union, the nation that created and became the first great communist state of the 20th century, change was apparent in the last 2 decades of the 20th century. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power as the premier of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev faced severe economic and political crises. In terms of the economy, the Soviet economy had been slowing substantially. Part of it was antiquated and overly extensive centralized management. The government trying to manage almost every facet of the economy proved to be a daunting challenge, especially as industrialization raced ahead and economic activity expanded and became more complex. And internationally, the Soviet Union faced the problem of remaining competitive with the United States, Western Europe, and Japan, with their economic growth quickly beginning to outpace that of the Soviet Union. During the 1930s and 40s and into the 1950s even, the reverse had been true. The Soviets had been outpacing the Americans and the Europeans and actually starting to close in on them. Now they were falling behind. There was also a fundamental political crisis. One of the basic problems for the Soviets was that their totalitarian system really had no room for dissent. People had really only 2 choices: either embrace the party or become a dissident and face persecution, exclusion, not only politically but economically, etc. As a result, we find a growing middle class, which is increasingly discontented with a political system that really offers them no viable options. in terms of their participation, because they can either simply support the Soviet state or they have to become dissidents, and of course that has a highly negative impact upon their position in society. And they have an additional gripe, and that is, of course, that the Soviet economy has been focused largely on large-scale projects, power stations, steel mills, tractor plants, defense spending, and relatively little spending on the consumer goods that had become the hallmark of the United States in particular, but also Western Europe. So they have a discontented middle class, both because of political exclusion and because this middle class can look at the West and see a lifestyle, a set of commodities that are generally scarce, if available at all, in the Soviet system. Facing those problems, Gorbachev launched the Soviet Union on a project of reform. Political reform known as glasnost, and perestroika, which was to be a form of economic liberalization, to free up the economy to some degree from the strict state controls that had dominated ever since the 1920s. So aside from whatever crisis might have struck in Latin America that led to the adoption of neoliberal policies, there is also change in the Soviet Union driven by other factors, by problems of a slowing economy and problems of political disaffection. And Gorbachev is trying to address those with these reform strategies. One expression of this reform effort was the creation of the Congress of People's Deputies in 1988. It was meant to give greater expression to political dissidents, to allow for representation of political views other than that of just the Communist Party. The law of cooperatives in 1988, which sounds like it's a law to create cooperative economic ventures, was actually just the opposite. What it was meant to do was provide the legal basis for private ownership of businesses. When you think about it for a moment, if you're living in an authentic communist society and economy and state, as people in Russia were, there's really no basis, legal basis, for private property. You can open up a store, but what is the legal protection that you have? There's nothing to prevent the government from coming in and saying, your enterprise is illegal. Okay? We don't allow this kind of thing, so we're just seizing it. So there was no legal basis. So the law of cooperatives was meant to create a legal basis so people could actually create private businesses and have a legal structure that offered them some degree of protection. However, much of what Gorbachev attempted to do proved to be too little too late. One of the problems that would drag down his reform efforts was Afghanistan. Afghanistan, which lay at the southern border of the Soviet Union, was governed by a political party that was pro-Soviet. This was something that the Soviets were deeply concerned with because, much like their Tsarist predecessors, they were well aware of the fact that millions of people living in the republics along their southern border were Muslims. And they were in constant fear that one movement or another would emerge that would mobilize these Muslim populations and present a formidable challenge to Soviet rule. Afghanistan, which lay right on that border, was of particular concern. So the Soviet interest in having essentially a client state in Afghanistan was for the purposes of maintaining stability in their own Muslim republics. But by 1979, that client state was facing rebellion from Islamic guerrillas. who had taken up arms against that government. And the Soviets now poured tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of troops into Afghanistan to try to protect that client state and suppress the rebellion. The rebellion grew, gaining support not only from the United States but from many Middle Eastern countries. And finally, in 1989, the last of the Soviet troops that had been sent to Afghanistan had to be withdrawn. It was an enormous blow to the prestige of the Soviet military, very much akin to what had happened in the United States with the collapse of Vietnam in 1975. But in this case, it was occurring in a society which was going through dual political and economic crises and which was struggling to try to reform itself. Hardly a vote of confidence in the Gorbachev regime. Between 1989 and 1991, the Soviets faced another major blow as communist governments in Eastern Europe began collapsing. Places like Poland and East Germany. The members of what was known as the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was a defense alliance between Eastern European countries and the Soviet Union. Well, the members of the Warsaw Pact, these Eastern European countries, were witnessing the collapse of communism in one country after another. This buffer that the Soviets had created between themselves and Western Europe was disintegrating, as was the myth of communist superiority as these various societies threw off Soviet domination. And Gorbachev was unwilling to use force to try to maintain communist regimes in Eastern Europe. Again, he was trying to pursue a strategy of political reform, that the Soviets were not going to try to maintain this vast empire, but this also meant serious losses for the Soviet economy. These countries had supplied not only markets, but often valuable resources for fueling the Soviet economy. And as they emerged as independent states, no longer tied to the Soviet Union, this meant serious losses for the Soviets. In 1991, a group of dissident military and political figures who felt that Gorbachev was leading the party and the Soviet Union to ruin, attempted to overthrow the government. They attempted a military coup, in essence. That coup was frustrated, but in the process, it cost Gorbachev his position. And he was then replaced by Boris Yeltsin, another reformer, not quite of Gorbachev's stature, and a man very much addicted to consumption of large amounts of alcohol, but nevertheless a reformer. And eventually, Boris Yeltsin gave way to Vladimir Putin. Putin, who had been previously a senior, indeed commanding member of the secret police, the Soviet intelligence network, now became the ruler of the Republic of Russia. The liberalization process, particularly in terms of economic activity, would continue. But it would be liberalization Russian style. Elections continued to be held. The Duma, the representative body, would continue to meet. But Putin managed to control those elections and ensure the domination of political groups loyal to him. Furthermore, many of the largest economic enterprises in Russia were taken over by what were known as apartchiks. These were individuals who had been leading officials in the old Communist Party, in the old Soviet system. And they were using their authority and their capital to take over many of the key economic sectors, including oil production. So what emerged was not necessarily a fully liberalized economic system. It was certainly increasingly driven by market considerations, because we have private enterprise, but much of it is controlled by former Communist Party officials, and they use their political authority to create economic monopolies in key sectors of the economy. Furthermore, the reform system also had been marked by the collapse of the Soviet system of social support, meaning retirement benefits, housing, health care, education. All of these suffered drastic declines. The percentage of the population officially, and this is probably a conservative estimate, calculated as falling below the poverty line was 25%. The average lifespan of Russian citizens began dropping drastically during the 1990s. Mortality rates began rising rapidly. And for most citizens of Russia, the new liberalized system meant severe economic suffering. So in Russia, we do get liberalization, we get an end to the old communist regime, we do get the creation of private enterprise, and we get at least the formalities of elected government. But there are serious problems with this new system in terms of control of the political system from the top, and in terms of the poverty into which so many Russian citizens fell as a result of the changes, and the fact that a very small but very wealthy group emerges at the top, controlling some of the most valuable resources of the country. China's reform, which I touched on briefly when we were talking about the ends of the Chinese Revolution, is a little more systematic in form. As I mentioned, in the 1970s, after Mao Zedong's death, he was eventually replaced by a man named Deng Xiaoping, who had been a key official in the Communist Party for decades. He had been on the Long March, which had rescued the party from the encirclement by the nationalists. But he had fallen afoul of Mao Zedong and his strategies during the 1950s and 60s, because Deng Xiaoping wanted to engage in liberalization. He did not really support Mao's ideas of creating a totally egalitarian society with equal wealth for all, avoiding bureaucratization, all of those things that had driven the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. During the Cultural Revolution, Deng Xiaoping, again, as I had mentioned, was arrested, sentenced to house imprisonment, and only after Mao's death was he able to reemerge as a key figure and eventually assume leadership. One of the distinctions between China and Russia is that the Chinese communists had long held the support of the peasant population. The reforms in agriculture in China had fit far more closely with traditional practices in the Chinese countryside than had the Soviet system of collectivization. Chinese peasants, of course, had been the principal beneficiaries of the revolution as they received land as the communists fought their way to power. And that fact, combined with the fact that when Deng Xiaoping took power, he began to liberalize the agricultural system to allow peasants to sell their products on an open market instead of simply turning them over to a government distribution system. So peasants benefited both from the land that they held and now from the fact that they could benefit from the market economy. They could charge higher prices for their products. So the distinction here is that the communist regime in China maintained the support of the rural population through many of these drastic changes in the 1970s and 80s. Whether that's still true is another matter, but at the outset they did. So while there's a highly complex changeover to be managed, the Chinese did not face the immediate problem of the potential disintegration of their base of support, as was happening in the Soviet Union. Deng launched China on a program of what he called the 4 modernizations: to modernize agriculture, science, defense establishment, and industry in general. What did that mean exactly, to modernize these? Well, part of it, of course, would mean the introduction of improved technologies in agriculture, defense, industry, and of course, science itself. But it also meant a liberalization, such as opening up the peasant agricultural enterprise to the market so that goods could be sold in an open market. It would also mean gradually reducing the role of the state in industry, because almost all major industries were controlled by the state. Not every one, but most. Things like steel plants, etc. The state would begin to reduce its role and allow private enterprise to take a much larger role in areas such as industry and even in the development of defense equipment, etc. So we again have a liberalization policy going on, a movement away from strictly state control. Now, all of this, of course, was absolutely contrary to what Mao had envisioned, especially with the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. This was not going to be equality for all. In fact, over time, over several decades, millions of workers would lose their jobs in steel plants and other state industries as these were downsized, eliminated, sold off, etc. And they would find themselves in rather desperate circumstances. The other aspect of this was gradually to allow renewed foreign investment, something that really had occurred in only very minor ways ever since the Chinese Revolution in 1950. After all, China had been subordinated to the great powers under the system of treaty ports. As we've seen, the last thing that the communists had wanted was to reintroduce foreign corporations. But now, under the new regime, foreign corporations would be allowed opportunities to invest. In fact, China began experimenting with this whole process of private enterprise and foreign investment by creating what were called special economic zones. And these were mostly the large port cities, many of them the same treaty ports that the Europeans had once dominated. These special economic zones would both promote private enterprise, allowing the creation of all kinds of private businesses, and be places where foreigners, Americans included, could come and invest in certain types of industry. Now, the Chinese, of course, are very intent on the idea that they're going to guide these investments, where they're going to invest where we want them to invest, and they will invest under conditions that we consider favorable to us. But nevertheless, again, this is a radical shift from the past. China's opening itself up to foreign investment, it's seeking to expand its trade with the rest of the world, and it's generally privatizing its industrial base. Again, this leaves peasants and workers very much on their own. Workers feel the impact first as they lose jobs, as they find they no longer have that social safety net that Mao had created for them. But peasants also begin to feel the pinch, even though they had been the principal base of support for the regime, and they certainly benefited both from the land that had been redistributed and from the opening up of opportunities for sales of their goods in free markets. But over time, they also had to face the reality that they were in a competitive situation. They had to make the go on their own. There was no guarantee of purchases by the state. There was no automatic supply of fertilizer or other needs from the government. And there was also the simple fact that as they tried to improve efficiency, it meant that there were fewer opportunities for peasants to work the land. If you are going to expand, let's say you're an ambitious peasant, you buy up several other small peasant holdings around you so you can expand and use more efficient methods, that means there's less land to distribute to others. And of course, there's a growing rural population. And what begins to happen in China by the 1980s is first a trickle and then a flood of millions of people flowing out of the countryside and into the cities. Even though technically this is illegal. You can only move out of the countryside and into an urban area with government permission. Why? Because the government is fearful that this mass exodus from the countryside will create impossible conditions in the urban areas. That there'll be millions of people unemployed, living in shanty towns around the great cities, and they will be deeply discontented because there won't be the social services and jobs that they need, and that will create upheaval in the country. So the other great concern of the Chinese regime, as it has launched itself on this process of modernization, has been trying to maintain stability. Initially, for example, since migrants from the countryside were in the cities illegally, their children weren't even allowed to go to school because they were illegal immigrants. And if they had a school, it would have to be something that the illegal immigrants themselves organized in order to educate their children. Over time, the regime has slackened some of these harsher prohibitions and has tried to adapt to the increasing shift of population. But again, it's constantly racing to keep up with these radical changes that the state itself has initiated. What follows in quick order at the end of the 1980s and beginning of the 1990s is the collapse of the Soviet Union itself in 1989, following on the rapid disintegration of the states of the Warsaw Pact. The Soviet Union itself has essentially disappeared. By the time of the era of Boris Yeltsin and Vladimir Putin, there really is no Soviet state anymore. It has become the Russian Republic once again. Aside from that kind of dramatic political change, where the center of world communism disintegrates, other major changes that were coming about included a communications revolution. Not only satellites that could beam signals of various forms of communication, from telephone messages to GPS signals, but also, of course, the revolution in computers, which in 3 short decades, in the end of the 20th century, revolutionized the processing of information and began to affect virtually every aspect of economic activity in the world, whether it was manufacturing, marketing, distribution, accounting, any aspect of business enterprise you can imagine, as well as governmental enterprise, was affected by the computer revolution. As the world economy begins to open up, as Latin American countries begin pursuing neoliberal policies, the Soviet Union goes through reform, India essentially moves towards a neoliberal philosophy, and China begins to liberalize as well. As more than half of the world's population is being opened up to these market forces that they were largely shut off from through most of the 20th century, we create an increasingly competitive international market. Many countries in the developing world, Latin America, Africa, and Asia, originally counted on the fact that labor in their economies was very cheap in order to attract investment. For example, U.S. auto manufacturers would go to Mexico to build plants because they knew Mexican workers got paid a mere fraction of what American workers did. And similar kinds of processes were occurring in other industries, such as textiles, steel, etc. as corporations from developed countries with high wage levels, whether in the United States or Europe or even Japan, began looking overseas for cheaper labor. But in this rapidly liberalizing international economy, where virtually all economies are open up to the international market, that specific advantage is increasingly insignificant. Because while Mexico's labor might be cheap in the 1970s, it can hardly compete with cheap labor in China in the 1980s and 90s. So, a new strategy that developing countries begin to create are what are called export processing zones, and later general purpose zones. This begins in Mexico with a program of maquiladoras. Maquiladoras, what are they? Maquiladoras are manufacturing plants set up in Mexico which can import goods from other countries to make their product without having to pay import duties. So if you have your maquiladora, your plant in Mexico, usually in northern Mexico, near the US border, the items that you bring in, let's say you're making handheld calculators, and you need wiring and plastic, et cetera, all that stuff you can bring in import duty free. And then once you've made your handheld calculators and send them to the United States for sale, the only export duty you pay is on the value that you added. In other words, the difference between the value of the goods when you imported them and what they're worth now as put together as a handheld calculator. That strategy of allowing you to import goods duty-free to then manufacture them into an export was expanded with the free trade zones, the export zones, the general purpose zones. These zones were places where you could come as a manufacturer and not only bring the goods in duty-free, as with maquiladoras, but when you ship them back out, you wouldn't pay any export duty. There would be no duties at all. So it's a duty-free zone. A general purpose zone means you can go in and do any kind of manufacturing you want. Make automobile parts, make electronic parts, computers, etc. From goods that you've imported elsewhere in the world, you bring them in free, the imports, and when you export your computers or whatever else, no duty going out. Why? Because countries want to attract these manufacturers. They're already pretty much competing on a level playing field in terms of cheap labor, so how do we gain an advantage? We say duty-free. And that means we get jobs, because the corporations come in and invest. Now, multinational corporations around the world could go to a variety of places in Latin America, or in Africa, or in Asia, and find places where they could invest and not have to pay any import or export duties. These were overseas platforms that were incredibly profitable. Now, it's not just trade in goods, which has been going on for centuries and centuries, that's speeding up, but also the movement of money into different parts of the world, capital and technology, to take advantage of these opportunities. So the process of integrating the world economy accelerates. At the same time, the spread of especially American consumer goods, which we saw occurring in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, but limited mostly to sort of luxury items like whiskey and watches, etc. In the final decades of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century, that consumer economy, consumer markets, are deepening and widening. And what that means is, first of all, that the different levels of society who can now gain access to consumer goods is increasing. Now it's just not people at the very top, the elite, or even just the upper middle class. Now more and more you go down to the middle class, the working class, peasants, and they all can gain access to at least some consumer goods. Who can't afford a Coca-Cola? Whether you're living in a rural area of Mexico, on a mountainside in Mongolia, doesn't make any difference. Coca-Cola is there, and you can afford it. But in addition, the market is widening because it isn't just the US, Europe, Japan, maybe Latin America, as it was in the 50s and 60s. Now, Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, China, all of these places are opening up. And places like Latin America that had protectionist duties, and India, are lowering. So again, the number of people who can be exposed to the consumer economy is vastly expanding. So in each country, people from the top to the bottom of the social and economic scale can engage in consumerism, and more people around the world. This is what we talk about, the deepening and widening of the consumer market. Coca-Cola is really the pioneer in this regard. It's the first product as a true consumer product to truly be global in its marketing. All the way back in the 1960s even, Coca-Cola was starting to penetrate into Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And naturally, by the time of the 1980s, it had spread not only through those regions, but it was already beginning to penetrate China. And it became the best known consumer logo in the world. But that was hardly the end of this process. Dozens and then hundreds and thousands of products were spreading, from McDonald's to Nike's, a whole range of basic consumer goods, from clothing to food items to small technical, electronic pieces of equipment, video games, etc., was beginning to spread around the world. And for many of these companies, such as Coca-Cola, Nike, and now even McDonald's, their international operations would become even more important than their domestic operations. Coca-Cola earns more through its international sales than it does in the United States. In fact, its international sales are now, its domestic sales are now declining, while its international sales continue growing. So you have this vast expansion. And this is being driven in no small part by enormous budgets for advertising. This doesn't just get done by itself. Multinational corporations spend over $450 billion a year advertising their products. And of course, they use the same fundamental mechanisms that have been employed in the United States ever since early in the 20th century. Again, they're selling a message of happiness, that there are positive attributes to these products. It's not just a matter of consuming, some kind of dark liquid with bubbles in it. You're actually maximizing your happiness. And of course, as we talked about last time, you're also starting to establish an identity for yourself. And you may think, well, drinking a Coke hardly establishes an identity, right? Well, maybe not in our society anymore, but in other cultures. It says something about the person who is drinking a Coke, that I'm breaking away from traditional forms of refreshment. And this has happened in many countries that have long depended on other types of liquids as traditional forms of beverages. When you make a decision that, well, now I want to drink Coca-Cola, you are making a decision, well, I want to be part of this larger consumer economy. I want to share in some of the values that I see as linked with it. So it isn't just a matter of, oh, it tastes good. That's a matter of taste, of course. It's a matter of what values do you see linked to the consumption of that item. And even in our own culture, we still constantly are engaged in the purchase of goods at the consumer level because they supposedly help define us in who we are. What kind of car do you drive? And you can almost tell, unless it's a teenager who's just driving his parents' car. What kind of person is probably driving a certain kind of car? Okay, whether it's a sports car, if you're driving a Toyota Camry, everybody knows you're middle-aged, middle class, okay, and have no imagination. That's what you identify with. I know people in the room, I have a Camry. But, you know, oh God, I'm driving a Camry. But part of this is the idea of identity. What kind of clothes do you wear? You know, do you wear T-shirts? Do you wear, you know, a baseball cap? Jeans? You're supposedly creating an identity for yourself that you're part of this contemporary culture. Or you're choosing not to be. What if you decide to go Gothic? You're making a statement. I'm rejecting what I see, although, of course, you're actually participating in it because you're buying all this stuff at a store. But still, it's an attempt to use consumption of consumer goods to make a statement about the consumer culture. Another thing that we think we're doing, at least, is defining ourselves as individuals. Well, that's why I wear this kind of shirt. Marks me as very different. Teenagers in particular are subject to this kind of thing. And then you say, well, wait a minute, you know, there are 8,000 of these shirts on the rack here, and you're telling me when you buy one that somehow you're setting yourself off as an individual? But that's the idea, possessed in the good, that this will be different from what the other kids have. Not too different, but different enough to mark me as someone else. So again, this whole culture of absorbing an identity or creating an identity through the consumption of goods is going on as this consumer economy spreads. To further propel this process, the United States and other developed countries began creating a system which would systematically lower tariffs around the world. They had begun all the way back in 1947 with what was known as the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. The GATT, or the General Agreement on Tariffs or Trade, was essentially a fairly rigid organization. It was basically an agreement to try to bring down tariffs on trade, to open up trade. With the creation of the World Trade Organization, which really succeeded the GATT, you have a much more activist effort. Once the World Trade Organization is created, although this was beginning to happen before its actual creation, but what it marks is a process by which countries around the world, particularly the developed countries, are meeting on a regular basis to try to hammer out new agreements which are designed time and again to lower protectionism in countries around the world, to lower tariffs and quotas and all kinds of things, to systematically lower trade barriers globally. So it isn't just individual countries who decide to liberalize. There is an international effort, a cooperative effort, to promote that process. And of course, there are inducements to get countries to participate, because if you don't, then you get left out. If you don't agree to what the World Trade Organization is doing, if you don't participate in the World Trade Organization, then you don't benefit from these reductions. So there is a powerful magnet to draw countries in and get them to lower their tariffs and their other obstacles. As this has happened, we see consumer culture appear in almost every imaginable environment. In northern Argentina, by the 1990s, a major cultural shift was taking place. By the 1990s, at Christmas time, the principal symbol of Christmas had become Santa Claus. And Santa Claus depicted as he was in the 1930s by Coca-Cola. I mean, the image we have of Santa today with his black boots and his big back belt and his red suit, and he's pudgy and got a big flowing beard, that was created by Coca-Cola. There are other earlier images of Santa, but he doesn't really look anything like our Santa now, or Coca-Cola's Santa if you want. That image is the one that came to predominate in northern Argentina, which marked a radical change, because Argentina had and Argentinians traditionally celebrated Christmas in European form, which meant the focus was on the three kings, the three wise men, and they're bringing gifts. But now it had shifted to an American Santa Claus. Furthermore, hypermarkets began to emerge, the kind of mass retail establishment that might include a supermarket and, something like a super Target, would recognize. These hypermarkets, or hypermercados in Spanish, began to emerge in the region as well. So mass consumer distribution. A shopping mall emerged. And it was given the rather interesting mixed name, the Paseo Shopping. Paseo meaning a passageway or walking, and shopping. But the word shopping was critical because the Spanish version of shopping is hacer compras, which means to make purchases, which is kind of dull and uninteresting and not identified in people's minds with the adventure of shopping. How often have you said to somebody, oh, let's go shopping? Not as, I need to go out and buy, a can of meat, but we're going shopping because we're going to go enjoy ourselves. We'll buy some clothes, try on some outfits, waste our money, run up our credit cards. But shopping, that word, has that identification. So the Spanish word needed to be replaced to convey that image of what you were doing here was not just going out and buying necessities. You're out shopping, engaging in a consumer experience. Something else that has emerged in Argentina, in Latin America, and really increasingly in the rest of the world, is tourism and markets for folk crafts and folk culture. Tourism has become an increasingly large part of the economies of many countries in the developing world. Part of it, of course, is facilitated by the fact that commercial airline traffic has absolutely exploded since the 1960s. Millions and millions of people every day are traveling on planes, and it means they have access as tourists to every far-flung corner of the world. To attract people, countries have created focal points for folk culture, where you can go and see, oh, there's an authentic Indian. And you can define Indian as you want, somebody from the Indian subcontinent, or an American Indian, or a Latin American Indian. But it's somebody who's authentic. See, they're dressed in certain clothes. And from that person, you can buy an authentic craft. Of course, it may say made in Hong Kong on the bottom, but it's authentic. Okay? Well, it's got a logo on it. It has a llama on it, so it must be authentic. It's from the Andes. Okay? Or it has Shiva on it. It must be from the Indian subcontinent. The appeal of all of this is that these goods, for us, are supposedly authentic. That we live in a manufactured culture. I mean, everything we see around us is essentially made by a machine for commercial purposes. But supposedly, when you go on a tourist venture, you can go and buy some authenticity, get back to the world as it really was before globalization. In fact, much of this stuff is being manufactured for tourists. Most of the folk crafts that you buy have been designed consciously. It's not that they don't represent actual symbols and logos that are of significance in the local culture, but they've been specifically crafted and designed to appeal to you. So you'll buy them. So the matter of authenticity is a little bit up in the air here. But nevertheless, it has the appeal to people around the world. And here we get a new set of cultural interactions in another marketplace, where on the one hand, people in developing countries can join the market economy. And on the other hand, millions of consumers from developed countries can think that they're buying for themselves some element of authenticity in their otherwise manufactured existence. Another issue that's come up as the world is globalized is whether people's identities are changing. When we saw the collapse of imperialism and the emergence of new nations, we saw the powerful force of nationalism as countries in Africa and the Middle East and Asia struggled to create national identities. And these were very powerful identities in the second half of the 20th century. But now the question has been raised whether people in developing countries are in fact losing that nationalist identity and beginning to absorb a consumer identity. Again, as I mentioned before in the earlier session, we have multiple identities. But will our identities as defined by consumerism become our predominant identities? You know, who are you? How do you define yourself? Is it going to be by religion, by nationality? Or is it going to be, well, I'm the kind of person that wears stuff from the Gap. Okay? So I'm not really on the top of the fashion world, but I'm a Gap kind of person. That's your identity, I guess. But this is an issue. We don't know how much this is actually happening. But we may be redefining ourselves and how we identify ourselves in the process of engaging in this global process of consumerism. Another area where we've seen the spread of culture is in religion. Now, religion was an important part of the American mission all the way back in the 18th century, as Americans saw themselves presenting a new reformed Christianity to the world. And American missionaries were important again. By the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, working in places like Latin America and China. But another religious wave has come in the 20th century that has had even more profound influence, especially in Latin America and Africa, and it's Pentecostalism. Pentecostalism is a variation of evangelical movements within Protestant Christianity, and it puts particular emphasis on the Holy Spirit. Pentecostalism traces its roots to an African-American preacher, William Joseph Seymour, who was preaching Pentecostalism to a congregation in Los Angeles as early as 1906. Pentecostalism, which looks for a very direct and personal experience with God, and often has features such as speaking in tongues and curing of the sick, has spread dramatically in Latin America and Africa, especially in the second half of the 20th century. Now, this is very much an American religion. It was founded, emerged, shaped in the United States in the first half of the 20th century. But over time, it has been nationalized. If we look at Pentecostal churches in Latin America and Africa, almost all of their clergy are locals. So it has become local religion. And many of the practices and rites of Pentecostalism have been influenced by local culture. So here we have another cultural output, if you will, of the United States. But we also see how it's absorbed but also changed as it's received in other societies. There are many explanations of how Pentecostalism has spread in the globalized world. And of course, much of it has to do with people's individual religious experiences. But one important factor is that Pentecostalism has been particularly successful in societies undergoing rapid and often disruptive experiences of globalization. As people's worlds rapidly change, as market forces come to influence their lives more and more, and as they often find that despite the wonders of consumerism, many of them are left behind, that they see this world out there of seemingly endless opportunity to consume, but often find that they themselves cannot gain ready access to it. Pentecostalism in many ways helps people reconcile these problems. It envisions a world in which people are focused on individual salvation, and it accepts a world in which there will still be evil. These kinds of perspectives that can be accepting of both the promise of consumerism, but also the reality for millions of people that they do not have ready access to these wonders, helps explain in part the spread of Pentecostalism in the world. But even more significant for our purposes is that it's one of many cultural manifestations of American society that have been absorbed but also modified as they have spread throughout the globe. Not just is it Pentecostalism that is reshaped by local culture, but Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is an American drink, right? Well, except it's used to make Cuba Libres, a Cuban drink. Except it's used by a shaman in Mexico to drive out evil spirits. Not exactly purposes to which its original creators had put it to mind. So throughout this process of globalization, we're seeing massive influences of American enterprise, American economic policies, and American culture. But at the same time, many of these are being modified and reshaped as they are absorbed in other societies. And as we will see next time, it's not always absorption, but rejection, which also occurs in the process of globalization.